As I sat there watching the video, it felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. On the screen was my wife, moving seductively on the dance floor with a man I once trusted as a friend. The footage captured every intimate detail, their bodies swaying together, her laughter ringing out, and then the kiss. That kiss. It left no room for doubt about what was going on. A wave of betrayal washed over me, hot and searing, but before I could even think about confronting her, life threw an unexpected curveball. Karma had its own plans, and let me tell you, it hit harder than I ever could have imagined. But before we dive into how everything unfolded, let me know in the comments below where you're tuning in from. If you're into stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. The faint glow of my laptop screen lit up the dim room, a quiet escape from the chaos of everyday life. The sound of sneakers squeaking against a hardwood court echoed softly from the speakers as I watched a familiar clip. There was Thompson, Big L. Johnson, effortlessly nailing a buzzer beater from way beyond the arc. The crowd erupted into cheers, but I only managed a faint smile, my eyes following Thompson's fluid movements. He had always made it look so easy, hadn't he? To the right of the screen, a list of video clips waited to be watched, but I ignored them for now, content to soak up the nostalgia of Thompson at his prime. With his golden blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, Thompson had the kind of effortless charisma that could have made him a movie star. Back in college, he wasn't just a basketball legend, he was the guy everyone wanted to be around. And as luck, or misfortune, would have it, I had known him. We'd crossed paths often, living in the same apartment building during those years. Off the court, his charm didn't falter. He was quick with a joke, always wearing that easy grin that made people want to stay in his orbit. As the highlight reel ended, I leaned back in my chair, the soft creak of the seat breaking the silence. My cursor hovered over the next video in the queue, which I assumed would be another compilation of his glory days on the court. But the title caught my attention, Big L, Another Conquest. I frowned, hesitating for a moment before clicking play. The video opened to the thrum of a Miami nightclub, neon lights casting a kaleidoscope of colors over a packed dance floor. And there, in the middle of it all, was Thompson. His trademark ponytail was shorter now, but he was still unmistakably himself. He wasn't alone, though. He was dancing, far too closely, with a stunning blonde. My stomach knotted. Something felt wrong. As the camera zoomed in, my pulse began to race. The woman wasn't just anyone. It was Kate. My wife. Her laughter, a sound I had always cherished, now felt like a blade twisting in my chest. She leaned into him, their bodies moving in a way that left no doubt about their intentions. The dance was charged, every movement dripping with intimacy. I couldn't tear my eyes away as she tilted her head back, the club lights catching her blonde hair just right. Thompson pulled her even closer, and then, like the universe wanted to rub salt in my wounds, the video ended with them locked in a deep, passionate kiss. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A sharp, twisting pain shot through my chest, blending anger and heartbreak into a storm I wasn't ready for. My hands hovered uselessly over the keyboard. I hit replay, desperate for some kind of misunderstanding. But no. Each frame confirmed what I couldn't bring myself to believe. There she was, Kate, the woman I had trusted more than anyone, wrapped in Thompson's arms, her betrayal laid bare for the world to see. My hands trembled as I saved the video to my laptop, the sound of the fan whirring faintly in the background. My jaw tightened. Reaching for my phone, I dialed her number, my fingers shaking, but all I got was the cold emptiness of unanswered rings. As the video replayed over and over in my head, the initial shock gave way to something sharper, darker. A fire ignited in my chest, a white-hot, all-consuming rage. The weight of betrayal seeped into every corner of his mind, settling in like an unwelcome guest. And for the first time, Luke understood, this wasn't just another rough patch. This was the start of something far worse. A shift he couldn't undo. He sat frozen, eyes locked on the dark screen where the video had just ended. His hands lay limp on the keyboard, his thoughts spinning in chaotic loops. For a long time, he didn't move. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint whir of his laptop's fan were the only things keeping him tethered to reality. Then, as if something inside him snapped, his fist came down hard against the desk. The sharp crack of knuckles against wood sliced through the silence. His coffee mug tipped over, sending lukewarm liquid spilling across the papers scattered next to his laptop, but Luke barely noticed. He was already up, pacing the small room in uneven circles. "How could she do this to me?" he muttered, the words catching in his throat. His voice was rough, like it had been dragged over gravel. How could she, after everything? His pacing stopped abruptly. Both hands gripped the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. He stared at the laptop's faint glow, his reflection staring back at him from the dark screen. Pale face. Red-rimmed eyes. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. It can't be." But it was. The proof sat right there on the hard drive, undeniable, unforgiving. And now, thanks to that damn video, the whole world was in on the secret. Luke's fists curled, nails biting into his palms. He couldn't just sit there. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of the storm that had just wrecked his life. His fingers trembled as he clicked to download the video, saving it to his laptop. His pulse thumped loudly in his ears as he snatched his phone and dialed Kate's number. One ring. Then two. Straight to voicemail. He stared at the screen, blinking in disbelief, then tried again. Nothing. "Pick up, Kate," he growled under his breath, jaw clenched tight. "Pick up the damn phone." But she didn't. Frustration boiled over. He hurled the phone onto the couch and dragged his hands down his face, trying to calm the chaos swirling in his head. He needed answers. And if Kate wasn't going to give them to him, someone else had to. He scrolled through his contacts until he landed on Ben Kovat's name. Ben was one of his oldest friends, the kind of guy you could trust without hesitation. And, conveniently enough, Ben was also at that Miami conference. The line rang a little longer than usual before Ben's voice finally came through, tentative. "Hello. Ben, it's Luke," he said, the tension straining every word. "I need to talk to you. Do you know where Kate is right now?" A long pause stretched out on the other end. Luke could hear Ben exhale slowly before answering. His voice sounded uneasy, like he'd been dreading this call. "Luke, man. I think you need to hear this. But it's not going to be easy." Luke's grip on the phone tightened. "Just tell me." Ben hesitated. Luke could practically hear him chewing over the words. Then, finally, he let it out. "She's been with Thompson. A lot. They've barely been apart since Tuesday night." Luke felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "You mean, she's staying with him?" Luke's voice came out hoarse, the words heavy in his mouth. Ben sighed. "Yeah. That's what everyone's saying. She hasn't been coming back to her room at night. I've seen them together, Luke. They're not even trying to hide it." Luke's legs buckled, and he sank down onto the couch, gripping the cushion so tightly his fingers dug into the fabric. His throat felt dry, and he swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump that had formed there. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Ben's voice softened. "I didn't want to believe it, man. I thought maybe it was just a fling, you know. Something she'd regret and pretend never happened." He trailed off, the guilt thick in his words. "I'm sorry, Luke. I really am." "Sorry doesn't fix this," Luke snapped, the anger surging back like a flash flood. He shot up from the couch and started pacing again, faster this time. "What the hell am I supposed to do now, Ben? My wife's screwing around with Thompson Johnson, and the entire internet has front row seats to the show. I don't know, man, Ben admitted quietly. I really don't. But you need to talk to her. Get her side of the story, at least. Luke stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on the dark windowpane. His reflection stared back at him, hollow and distant. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Tell me one thing, Ben. Has this been going on for a while, or is it just Miami? A heavy sigh drifted through the receiver. I can't say for sure, Luke. But after Tuesday night, it's like they've been inseparable. I didn't want to believe it either, but it's hard to ignore. Luke closed his eyes, letting the weight of Ben's words settle over him like a thick, suffocating fog. Thanks, Ben, he said eventually, his voice flat and drained of emotion. If you see her before her flight tomorrow, tell her not to bother coming home. I'll take care of the rest. Ben hesitated, the silence stretching out. I get it, Ben replied softly. I'm really sorry, Luke. I wish I had better news. Luke ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly but keeping it clutched in his hand. He stood there in the dimly lit room, staring at nothing, his thoughts a swirling mess of anger, shame, and disbelief. Betrayal was one thing. The humiliation, the way the whole world seemed to know, that was something else entirely. And in that silence, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. Luke slumped into his chair, the faint glow of the laptop screen illuminating the room. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the day he first met Kate. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes. It was junior year, the first day of math class. The room was almost empty when Luke walked in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Near the window, Kate sat alone, doodling in the margins of her notebook. The sunlight streaming through the glass caught in her hair, giving it a golden glow that seemed almost surreal. Without hesitation, Luke dropped into the seat beside her. Smart choice, she said, glancing up with a sly smile. Most guys are too nervous to sit near me. Luke laughed. I figured if you're sitting this far from the door, you can't smell that bad. Her laugh came quick and genuine, and in that instant, something clicked between them. That simple conversation spilled over into study sessions at the campus cafe, late-night walks, and shared jokes in between classes. Kate's sharp humor kept Luke on his toes, and he found himself drawn to the way her green eyes sparkled when she got excited about something. One evening stood out vividly, an impromptu trip to the local amusement park. Luke had insisted they ride the Ferris wheel, despite Kate's very vocal protests about heights. As the car creaked its way to the top, Kate's fingers gripped the safety bar, her knuckles white. But once they reached the peak, with the entire town sprawled beneath them, her tension eased. She leaned into Luke, laughing softly as the breeze tousled her hair. You planned this, didn't you? She teased, her voice quieter now. Maybe, Luke admitted with a grin, slipping an arm around her. I just wanted to see if I could make you laugh like that. Moments like that had built the foundation of their relationship, one moment, one laugh at a time. It wasn't just her beauty that drew Luke in. It was her ambition, her drive. Kate had big dreams of breaking into public relations, pouring hours into internships and networking events. Luke, meanwhile, buried himself in his chemistry degree, always joking that she was his favorite distraction. Back then, Kate had been dating Jason, a confident hockey player with a smirk that never quite faded. But Luke saw the cracks early on. Jason had a wandering eye and little appreciation for what he had. The end came not long after Jason got caught sneaking around with Lauren, Luke's next-door neighbor. Kate found out after a dinner party, and that was that. Luke had known about Jason's wandering ways for a while, but he'd wrestled with whether to tell her. In the end, Jason's carelessness made the decision for him. It's not the cheating that hurts the most, Kate had confessed one night as they sat in Luke's car. Her voice was distant, almost numb. It's that I feel so replaceable. You're not replaceable, Luke said, his voice unwavering. Not to me. It wasn't long after that their friendship began to shift, slowly but undeniably, into something deeper. Luke had invited her to join him at a bridge tournament on a nearby army base. It wasn't anything grand, just a casual event, but by the time the night ended, it had become the setting for their first kiss. Under the soft hum of fluorescent lights in the rec hall, they laughed, celebrating their modest victory. The glance they shared lingered a little too long, and when Luke leaned in, Kate met him halfway. After graduation, Luke proposed on a quiet evening at home. They were sitting on his small balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance, when he pulled a modest ring from his pocket and held it out to her. I don't have a big speech or anything rehearsed, he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I just know I can't picture my life without you. Will you marry me? Kate's eyes welled with tears, and she nodded, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. Yes, Luke. Of course, yes. Their wedding was simple but brimming with love, just the way they wanted it. Afterward, they moved into the house Luke had inherited from his grandfather, ready to start their life together. 2 years later, their twin daughters, Olivia and Ella, came along, and with them, their family felt whole. Parenthood brought its share of sleepless nights and long days, but Luke and Kate faced it side by side. Luke would warm bottles in the early hours while Kate rocked the babies back to sleep. As the girls grew older, they split the responsibilities. Kate handled school schedules and activities, while Luke took care of home repairs and weekend dinners. But as the years passed, cracks quietly formed beneath the surface. Kate's career in public relations took off, demanding more of her time, late hours at the office, business trips that stretched into weekends. Meanwhile, Luke transitioned into contract work from home. The isolation wore on him. Date nights became rare. And when they did happen, conversations felt mechanical, centered around calendars and to-do lists instead of their dreams or each other. Luke began noticing subtle shifts in Kate. She seemed distant, distracted. Her phone rarely left her side, buzzing at all hours with emails and messages she dismissed as work-related. When Luke suggested they take a vacation, she hesitated. Work's just crazy right now, she'd say. Maybe next year. Luke tried to ignore the growing pit in his stomach. He told himself it was just the natural rhythm of marriage, the ebb and flow of busy lives. But there were moments he couldn't shake. The way her hair looked slightly disheveled after late nights out. The faraway look in her eyes, even during their quiet evenings at home. Still, betrayal felt impossible. Luke believed they were just weathering the usual storms, the way they always had. But now, as he sat alone in their kitchen, replaying that video from Miami over and over in his mind, he realized how blind he had been. The signs had always been there. He just refused to see them. And now that fragile belief, that the two of them were unbreakable, was gone. Luke sat at the kitchen table, the glow of his laptop screen casting long shadows across the room. Kate's Gmail account was open in front of him. He'd spent the past hour piecing together a timeline, sifting through emails, phone records, and the video that shattered his world. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrolled through her inbox, searching for anything, that could explain or disprove what he already feared. Most of the emails were mundane. Work updates. Reminders. But then, a name jumped out at him. Thompson J. The subject line was deceptively simple. Great seeing you. Luke's fingers trembled as he clicked the message open. It was short. But damning. Kate. Thanks for a wonderful evening. You looked stunning. Let me know when we can talk again. Thompson. Luke clenched his jaw as nausea coiled in his gut. His eyes dropped to the timestamp. It was sent the morning after their first night in Miami. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. His mind spun. Where have we been? Luke grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as he pulled up their shared account. He scrolled through Kate's call logs, dread pooling in his stomach. 2 late-night calls to Thompson's number, made the week before the conference, stared back at him like undeniable evidence. His chest tightened. This didn't start in Miami. It had begun long before. The soft crunch of tires on the driveway snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. Luke straightened, every movement sharp and deliberate, as he walked to the front window. Peering out, he saw Kate stepping out of a cab, suitcase in hand. Her eyes flicked toward the house, exhaustion etched into her face, but something else lingered there too, hesitation. Luke didn't move to open the door. He stood there, heart pounding, watching her approach. Kate keyed in the code for the front door, but nothing happened. Her brows knit together in confusion as she tried again, pressing harder as if force alone would undo what he'd done. When the keypad stayed silent, she paused, her gaze drifting upward toward the house. Realization settled on her face. She knocked, softly at first, then louder. "Luke," she called, voice muffled by the heavy door. "Luke, please. Let me in. We need to talk." Luke's arms remained crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the floor. His jaw clenched as anger swirled just beneath the surface. The image of her dancing with Thompson, their kiss burning in his mind, played on repeat like a bad movie he couldn't shut off. "Luke, I know you're there," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she knocked harder. "Please, just let me explain." The sound barely registered. Finally, Luke pulled the door open. His expression was cold, unreadable. "You don't live here anymore," he said flatly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your things are in the garage." Kate's face crumpled. She took a small step forward, gripping the edge of the suitcase tightly. "Luke, please," she whispered, inching closer, but he lifted his hand, stopping her mid-step. "Don't," he said, his voice low and trembling with barely restrained fury. "Just don't." Kate's eyes glistened, tears trailing down her cheeks. "I made a mistake," she choked out, searching his face for any trace of softness. "I wasn't thinking. I got caught up in the moment. But I love you, Luke. I love our family. Please, just give me a chance to fix this." A bitter laugh escaped him. "A mistake." Luke's voice hardened, the words laced with disbelief. "You call 3 nights with Thompson Johnson a mistake? You think I can just forget what I saw? Like our daughters can forget?" As if summoned by his words, Olivia and Ella appeared at the top of the stairs. Olivia crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her eyes burning with fury as she glared down at her mother. "I hate you," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this to Dad? To us?" Ella lingered just behind her, silent but visibly shaken. She clung to the railing, tears welling in her wide eyes. "Mom. Why?" Ella's voice was barely a whisper, the confusion plain in her face. Kate turned toward them, her expression crumbling. "Girls, I don't." Olivia's voice shot through the air like a knife, cutting Kate's words short. "You don't get to talk to us like nothing happened. You ruined everything." Ella sniffled, her quiet sobs the only sound filling the gap between them. Kate moved to step toward them, but Luke was faster. He stepped directly into her path, his glare sharp enough to stop her cold. "Don't you dare," he said through clenched teeth, his voice shaking. "Don't drag them into this. You've done enough." Later that night, after Luke insisted Kate leave for her parents' house, he sat with Olivia and Ella in the living room. Olivia was still fuming, her face flushed red as she hugged a pillow to her chest. "Why didn't you just make her leave for good?" she snapped, glaring at the floor. Luke exhaled slowly, dragging his hand through his hair. "She's still your mother, Olivia," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "No matter how much I wish things were different, she's always going to be your mom." Ella wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, her voice shaking. "Is she ever coming back?" Luke hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted softly. His throat tightened as he glanced at both of them. "But what I do know is that I'm here. For both of you. Both of you. Always." Olivia didn't say anything, but her tense expression eased just a little. Ella leaned into him, seeking the kind of comfort only a father could offer, and Luke pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. In the days that followed, Luke poured everything he had into creating some sense of normalcy for the girls. Mornings were spent dropping them off at school, afternoons helping with homework, and evenings trying to hold himself together in their presence. He kept his own pain carefully bottled up, focusing on their needs. But the house felt hollow without Kate in it. Every time he walked past the garage, the sight of her packed belongings reminded him of the chaos she'd left behind. One afternoon, Luke caught Olivia sitting cross-legged on the couch, her phone gripped tightly in her hands. Her brow furrowed as she scrolled, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you looking at?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Without a word, she turned the phone toward him. Luke's stomach dropped. It was the video. The one that had detonated their lives like a bomb. "People at school keep sending it to me," Olivia said, frustration heavy in her voice. "They think it's funny." Luke took the phone from her and set it on the table, his hand lingering there for a moment. "You don't need to watch that," he said firmly. "Let me deal with it." "How?" Olivia asked, doubt flickering in her eyes. "You can't make it go away." Luke let out a quiet sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. She wasn't wrong. There was no erasing what had happened, no fixing it. But as he looked at his daughters, he felt something stir inside him. Maybe he couldn't erase the damage. But he could protect them from the fallout. "I don't know how yet," he admitted, meeting Olivia's gaze. "But I'll figure it out. I promise." The storm wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But if there was one thing Luke was sure of, it was that he wasn't going anywhere. Across town, Kate sat curled up on the bed in her childhood room, knees drawn to her chest. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows on the pale blue walls, the same walls she'd stared at as a teenager when the world felt like too much. The faint scent of lavender drifted through the air, a reminder of the evenings her mother would calm her with a soft hug and quiet words. But no scent, no childhood memory, could ease the weight pressing down on her now. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, dampening the sleeves of her sweater as she hugged herself tighter. "I can't stop thinking about Thompson." The thought hit her like a blade to the chest, sharp and unforgiving. She hated that it was true. His smile. His confidence. The way he made her feel wanted again. It was intoxicating, and utterly devastating. And with every memory of him came a heavier wave of guilt. It was wrong. It had always been wrong. Kate squeezed her eyes shut, trying to piece together how she had let things unravel so badly. The truth was simple, and painful. She hadn't felt alive in years. Life with Luke had become routine. Days blurred into one another, work deadlines, school schedules, laundry, dishes, the endless cycle of being a mother and a wife. She loved her family deeply, but somewhere along the way, she had started to feel invisible. Luke had retreated into himself, spending more and more time at home, rarely leaving his office. Their conversations had shifted from shared dreams to calendar reminders. Who was picking up the girls? Did the bills get paid? Had the car been serviced yet? And that was the extent of it. "I wish I could take it back." Her chest tightened painfully. "I wish I could stop myself from making that first mistake." The Miami trip had felt like a breath of fresh air at first, a chance to step away from it all, to exist outside of work and family for just a few days. And then Thompson appeared. He was larger than life, just as he had been in college. Seeing him had been like unlocking a door she didn't know was closed. He hugged her with the same charm he'd always had, his voice familiar and warm. "Still as stunning as ever," he had said, flashing that easy smile. Those words had filled a space inside her that she didn't even know existed. And when he pursued her, she hadn't pulled away. She could have. She should have. But she didn't. Why didn't I just say no? The question gnawed at her. Deep down, she already knew the answer. She had wanted to feel desired again. In Thompson's arms, she wasn't just Kate the mother, Kate the wife, Kate the planner. She was someone new, someone exciting and untethered from the weight of responsibility. But that fleeting rush had cost her more than she could bear. Luke's face when he opened the door earlier that day, that look, a mixture of pain, fury, and heartbreak, would haunt her for the rest of her life. And her daughters. The fury in Olivia's eyes and the quiet heartbreak on Ella's face haunted Kate as much as Luke's rage. She'd shattered the only world they'd ever known, for what? A few fleeting nights of selfish indulgence. Kate pressed her hands to her face, muffling the sobs that racked her body. I wish I could undo it all. Desperation clawed at her, sharp and relentless. I wish I could take their pain away. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating loudly in the stillness, but she didn't reach for it. She couldn't face anyone, not Luke, not the girls, not even her parents. They had welcomed her back into their home without a word, but the disappointment hung in the air like fog. Their silent judgment felt heavier than any words could. How do I even begin to fix this? The truth lay bare before her, she couldn't. Some things broke too deeply to be mended, and Kate feared her marriage was one of them. The thought hollowed her out, leaving nothing but an ache she couldn't shake. With a trembling breath, she wiped her face, trying to pull herself together. The house was quiet, her parents having retreated to bed hours ago. But the silence wasn't comforting. It pressed down on her, amplifying the thoughts she desperately wanted to escape. I need to be better. For them. The path ahead felt impossibly steep, but for the first time in days, a thin thread of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make amends. It wouldn't erase what she'd done. But she clung to that fragile hope because it was the only thing left. Kate lay down, staring at the ceiling as shadows shifted with each passing car. Sleep felt distant, hovering just out of reach. The cool night air brushed against Luke's skin as he followed the winding path through the park. Leaves rustled softly in the breeze, their whispers the only sound apart from the occasional hum of distant traffic. Restlessness had hounded him all day, keeping him pacing the house, unable to settle or focus. Now, his feet carried him forward on instinct, his thoughts circling the same relentless spiral of anger and confusion. It wasn't until he glanced up that he realized where he was, Thompson Street. Luke's jaw tightened. There it stood, Thompson's house. Large, sleek, modern. The kind of place that matched the man who owned it. Luke's eyes drifted to the basketball hoop in the driveway, another reminder of the man who had unraveled his marriage. His fists clenched. He turned away sharply, shoving his hands deep into his jacket pockets, and headed for the park, his steps brisk and deliberate. The rhythmic thump of a basketball echoed from up ahead. Luke's heart skipped, his pulse quickening. His eyes locked on the figure just beyond the trees. Thompson. There he was. Dribbling the ball with that same effortless grace that had made him a star. Luke froze. His breath caught in his throat. A surge of emotions flooded through him, rage, disgust, and a twisted satisfaction at seeing the man so unaware of his presence. Thompson hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on his game. He stepped back and launched a shot. The ball hit the rim, bouncing off and rolling lazily toward the street. Luke's hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms as he watched Thompson jog after it. Say something. Confront him. The urge to charge forward and unleash everything bubbling beneath the surface nearly overtook him. But his feet felt like lead, rooting him to the ground. Up ahead, a low engine rumbled in the distance. Headlights crept closer, casting long beams down the street. The ball rolled further than Thompson expected, stopping squarely in the middle of the road. Without a second thought, Thompson stepped onto the pavement, eyes fixed on the ball. Luke's heart pounded as the SUV appeared, speeding toward him. The headlights grew brighter, the engine louder. But Thompson didn't seem to notice. Thompson. Luke's voice cut through the cold night air. Thompson's head snapped up, eyes wide. But it was too late. The driver's horn blared, desperate and sharp, but the car was closing in too fast. The SUV struck Thompson with a brutal, hollow thud, the force throwing him onto the hood before his body tumbled to the asphalt with a sickening finality. The basketball rolled to a slow stop a few feet away, forgotten. Luke stood rooted to the spot, his pulse pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. His breath came in ragged gasps, the scene before him blurring around the edges. The SUV jerked to a stop, tires screeching against the pavement. Moments later, the driver, a gray-haired man with trembling hands, stumbled out, his face pale with panic. "I didn't see him," the man cried, his voice cracking. "I didn't see him." Thompson lay sprawled on the cold ground, twisted awkwardly, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Luke hesitated, his stomach twisting painfully. A dark part of him wanted to feel relieved, to see the man who had shattered his life laid low. But the sight of Thompson's motionless body filled him with something far more complicated. He deserved to suffer, Luke thought, his fists trembling at his sides. But not like this. His feet moved before his mind caught up, gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes as he crossed the street. Thompson's half-open eyes found him, and in that brief moment, Luke saw something that stole the air from his lungs. Fear. Thompson's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound followed. Luke knelt beside him, his hands hovering uncertainly over the broken man. "What could you possibly say to me now?" Luke whispered, his voice thick with anger, pain, and something he couldn't quite name. But Thompson said nothing. His chest rose once more, then fell still. Luke stayed there, frozen in place as the driver of the SUV spoke frantically into his phone. "There's been an accident," the man stammered. "A man was hit. I think he's gone." Luke stared at Thompson's lifeless body, unable to look away. Relief flickered somewhere deep inside him, but it was quickly drowned by guilt. "This isn't justice," he thought bitterly. "It's just more wreckage." Slowly, he rose to his feet, legs unsteady beneath him. The distant wail of sirens echoed in the night, growing louder as they closed in. By the time the paramedics arrived, moving with the cold precision of people accustomed to tragedy, Luke already knew the outcome. One of them glanced up at Luke and the driver, shaking his head. "He's gone." The words rang hollow in Luke's ears as he turned away, retreating from the flashing lights and frantic voices. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The walk home felt longer than it should have, his footsteps heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him felt grim satisfaction that Thompson was no longer a looming shadow over his life. But a deeper part of him, a part he hadn't expected, felt nothing but emptiness. Nothing had changed. The damage was still there, and no amount of punishment, no accident, could undo it. By the time Luke stepped through his front door, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. In the end, there were no victories here. Just loss, stretched out in every direction. The courtroom felt cold, the kind of sterile environment that drained the life out of everything it touched. Luke sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer flipping through documents with the ease of someone who had done this far too many times. Across the room, Kate sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than Luke remembered, fragile in a way that unsettled him. The sharp confidence she once carried had been replaced with a quiet stillness, as if she might disappear if she let go. Their eyes met briefly. Luke looked away first. The weight of her presence felt suffocating. The judge's voice droned on, rattling off the final terms of the divorce. Luke barely registered the words, his mind drifting elsewhere. He thought of Olivia and Ella, of how they were at school right now, blissfully unaware that the pieces of their family were being reshuffled in a way that could never be undone. The thought tightened something in his chest, but it also grounded him. Every painful step I take now is for them. That morning, Luke had risen early, the house quiet as he moved through the familiar motions of making breakfast. Bacon sizzled softly on the stove, and the coffee maker hummed in the background. It was a small moment. Ordinary. But Luke held on to it like an anchor, knowing that whatever came next, whatever heartache or confrontation awaited him, he had to be steady. For them. Olivia was the first to make her way downstairs, her hair still tangled from sleep. She slid into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, shooting Luke a look that hovered somewhere between gratitude and the remnants of lingering frustration. "Pancakes today?" she asked, her tone carefully even, as if testing the waters. Luke smiled softly, flipping one onto her plate. "Of course. Extra syrup?" She nodded, and for a fleeting moment, things felt almost normal. Then Ella appeared, rubbing at her eyes with one hand while clutching her well-loved stuffed animal in the other. Without a word, she climbed onto the chair beside Olivia, leaning into her sister's side as if drawn to her for comfort. Luke placed a plate in front of her, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "How'd you sleep, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft. Ella shrugged, barely lifting her gaze. "Okay." Luke sat down across from them, watching as they picked at their food in silence. He wanted to say something, anything, that might ease the ache in their hearts. But the right words never came. Instead, he reached across the table, his hands settling gently over theirs. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise." Now, in the courtroom, the judge's voice echoed with finality as he asked if either of them had objections to the terms. Luke shook his head, his eyes fixed on the grain of the table, not daring to look up. Across the room, Kate hesitated. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, Luke thought she might say something, might try to undo the inevitable. But all she whispered was, "No." Her voice barely registered, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Luke felt something stir in him, pity, perhaps, but he shoved it down. There was nothing left to save. The gavel fell, and the judge's words confirmed what they both already knew. The marriage is dissolved. Luke stood, his movements slow and heavy as he gathered his belongings. One last time, he glanced at Kate. Her eyes glistened, but he looked away before she could say anything. Without another word, he left the courtroom and stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The house felt unbearably quiet when Luke returned that evening. Kate's absence lingered in every corner, a hollow presence that stirred memories he wasn't ready to face. But as he stepped into the living room, the sound of his daughter's laughter floated through the air. There they were, sprawled across the couch, giggling at the cartoon flashing on the TV. Luke smiled, the ache in his chest softening. "Hey girls," he said, dropping his keys onto the counter. "What's so funny?" Ella looked up, her face brightening as she waved him over. "Come watch, Dad. It's the one where the dog tries to drive the car." Luke chuckled, settling down between them. Ella crawled onto his lap, while Olivia leaned into his side. And just like that, the heaviness of the day lifted, replaced by the simple, irreplaceable joy of being with his daughters. As the weeks passed, Luke focused on piecing together something resembling a normal life. He built routines, making sure homework got done, dinner was cooked, and weekend trips to the park became sacred time. The house, though quieter, slowly started to feel like home again. There were hard moments. The empty spot in the closet where Kate's clothes used to hang. Ella's small voice asking if Mom would be home for dinner. But there were good moments too, Olivia's laughter during board games, Ella's joy as she helped him bake cookies. The scars hadn't faded, but as Luke tucked the girls into bed one evening, something stirred within him. It wasn't quite happiness. But it was close. Peace. He kissed them both goodnight, whispering softly before switching off the lights. Later, as he lay in his own bed, the quiet of the house settling around him, Luke allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to healing. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen as Luke sat at the table, sipping his coffee and watching his daughters get ready for school. Olivia, ever determined, was already dressed, brushing her hair with brisk, almost aggressive strokes. Ella sat sleepily at the counter, picking at a piece of toast and hugging her stuffed animal tightly to her side. "Don't forget your science project, Ella," Luke reminded her gently. "It's still on the dining table." Ella's eyes widened, and she shot up from her seat, nearly tipping her juice in the process. Luke chuckled softly, savoring the rare light-hearted moment. These small slices of normalcy had become his anchor, reminders that life, despite everything, still held bright spots. Mornings like this, filled with the hum of breakfast and sleepy conversation, grounded him more than anything else. In the months since the divorce, Luke had embraced a new rhythm. His days revolved around Olivia and Ella, making sure they had what they needed for school and life. Afternoons were a balancing act between contract work and personal projects, renovating the basement, fixing things that had been ignored for years, and tinkering with a software idea that had lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just about staying productive. It was about piecing himself back together, one day at a time. Luke stayed away from serious relationships. Friends nudged him to get out, to meet new people, but every date felt hollow. No matter how pleasant the company, there was always a lingering shadow, the memory of betrayal and the fear of letting anyone get too close again. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Olivia set down her fork and fixed him with a serious look. "Dad," she asked plainly, "are you ever going to get married again?" The question caught him mid-bite, forcing him to set down his own fork and take a breath. "I don't know, Bets," Luke admitted. "Right now, I'm just focused on you and Ella. That's what matters." Olivia nodded slowly, but she didn't look entirely satisfied. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment, searching for something unspoken. Ella, always the one to smooth things over, piped up. "We like it when you're here, Dad. We don't need anyone else." Luke smiled, warmth blooming in his chest despite the ache that followed. "I like being here too," he said, his voice soft. Kate's life was far different. She lived in a small apartment just a few miles away, but it felt like a different world altogether. Rebuilding wasn't easy. The weight of judgment pressed down on her wherever she went. Colleagues whispered. Friends drifted away, unsure of how to navigate the fallout. Even passing acquaintances seemed to look at her differently, as though her mistakes had left a mark visible to everyone. But it was the distance from Olivia and Ella that hurt the most. During visitation weekends, Olivia barely spoke to her. The tension simmered beneath every interaction. Ella was gentler, but even her affection felt tinged with sadness, like she wasn't sure if she could trust it yet. Determined to mend what she could, Kate started therapy. She dug deep, not just to understand what had led her down the path she'd taken, but to learn how to rebuild trust with her daughters. One Saturday, during their weekend together, Kate offered something different. "I thought we could volunteer at the animal shelter," she said cautiously, watching their reactions. "Walk some dogs, maybe play with the cats." Ella's face lit up almost immediately. But Olivia crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Why now?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "Is this supposed to fix everything?" Kate swallowed but didn't falter. No, she answered quietly. I just thought, it might be something we could enjoy together. Olivia hesitated, glancing at Ella, who tugged gently at her sleeve. Come on, Olivia, Ella urged. It might be fun. That afternoon, as they walked two playful puppies around the shelter, Kate felt the smallest flicker of hope. She knew it wouldn't happen overnight. Maybe not for years. But every step, every laugh from Ella or softened glance from Olivia, felt like a thread stitching the frayed edges of their bond back together. Back at home, Luke found his own moments of healing in unexpected places. One evening, while sifting through boxes in the garage, his hand brushed against an old photo album, one from their early years of marriage. He hesitated, flipping it open. There they were, him and Kate on their wedding day. His fingers hovered over the picture, a bittersweet pang tugging at his heart. Fond memories mixed with the ache of knowing how far they had drifted. With a quiet exhale, Luke closed the album and set it aside. The past is done, he reminded himself. What matters now is the future. His daughters. Their home. The life they were building, piece by piece. Though the betrayal still echoed in the quiet moments, Luke felt something new beginning to take its place. Strength. Little by little, it grew. He started running again, something he hadn't done in years, not since before the divorce. It wasn't about escape. It was about moving forward. On those quiet morning jogs, as the first light crept over the horizon, Luke found a peace that had evaded him for far too long. The rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement seemed to steady his thoughts, unraveling the tight knots that had settled in his chest over the past year. The twins were adjusting, too. Olivia's sharp edges softened bit by bit, her anger fading as she watched her father's unwavering commitment to their little family. Ella, with her gentle and forgiving heart, became the glue that held them all together, always quick to share a joke or brighten the room with her laughter. One evening, as the three of them sat curled up on the couch watching an old movie, Olivia leaned her head against Luke's shoulder. You're a good dad, she murmured, her voice quiet but sure. You know that? Luke smiled, his throat tightening at the unexpected tenderness of her words. Thanks, kiddo, he said, brushing her hair lightly with his hand. That means a lot. As the credits rolled and Ella drifted off to sleep, curled up on his lap, Luke felt something settle within him, a warmth he hadn't thought he'd feel again. Life wasn't perfect. The scars were still there, lingering beneath the surface. But they were healing, day by day, together. And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed they'd be okay. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden light, casting long shadows across the field. Luke sat quietly on a bench, watching Olivia and Ella chase each other through the grass, their laughter floating through the air like music. For the first time in months, he felt the weight on his shoulders lift. The pain was still there, but it didn't define him anymore. A few weeks earlier, Luke had shared coffee in his kitchen with Paul, his father-in-law. The atmosphere had been unusually heavy, the unspoken words between them louder than anything they said aloud. Eventually, Paul had set his mug down, his fingers tapping restlessly against the rim. Luke, there's something you should know. Luke raised an eyebrow but said nothing, sensing the weight in Paul's tone. I was worried about you, Paul began, staring into his cup like it held the answer to whatever he was struggling to say. After what happened with Kate and Thompson, I thought you might do something you'd regret. The implication hung thick in the air, and Luke felt his chest tighten. Paul's voice wavered slightly. I didn't plan for things to happen the way they did, he admitted. But I wanted to protect you, and protect Olivia and Ella. So I made sure Thompson ended up somewhere you'd see him. Somewhere it might resolve itself. Luke's breath caught, the memory of that night rushing back. The basketball rolling into the street. The flash of headlights. The SUV coming out of nowhere. He stared at Paul, disbelief twisting in his stomach. Are you saying? Paul met his gaze, his expression solemn. I didn't plan for him to die, Luke, he said softly. I just thought, if you saw him, it'd scare you enough to step back. Not, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now, sitting on the park bench, Luke couldn't shake the unease that Paul's confession had left behind. A part of him felt a quiet, reluctant gratitude. Paul, in his own way, had pulled Luke back from the edge, preventing him from making a mistake that could have cost him everything. But the thought of another man's death being orchestrated, even indirectly, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Luke's gaze drifted back to his daughters, who twirled and danced in the sun, their laughter echoing in the distance. And then it hit him, the past didn't have to define what came next. Life wasn't neat. It wasn't simple or fair. But it was still beautiful. Luke smiled softly, a quiet hope settling in his chest. The scars would remain. But maybe, just maybe, those scars could remind him of how far they'd come. And that was enough.